okay. I would love to have saved some of that beer. Of course, beer doesn't really keep that long, but I'm wondering how my beer actually tasted in those early days. For fun, we do experimental beers that we can kind of fill the niche. It's creative for us as brewers because part of brewing is science, but a lot is really the artist involved, and you really want to try different things. So we're always pushing the envelope a little bit.
During Prohibition, here on West 52nd Street was known as the wettest block of Manhattan. 21 Club is the last of maybe more than 50 speakeasies that existed at the time here on West 52nd Street. In order to find the illegal spirits, booze, wines, and beer that were kept in 21 during Prohibition, you'll have to go to the wine cellar, which is in the basement and is entered through the kitchen. During Prohibition, the wines and spirits at 21 were not located in the basement of the original restaurant, but rather in the basement of the neighboring landlord on the 19 West 52nd Street. When 21 was raided and the federal authorities tried to locate that wine cellar, they searched everywhere in the basement, lighting matches, looking for drafts. Where we're standing right now is an alcove, which was one of many during the time, and the wine cellar was never located by the federal authorities. And if only they knew that this 18-inch meat skewer that was hanging nearby was the key to the wine cellar, and if they looked among the thousands of holes in the wall here, located the right one, inserted that skewer at the right angle, and that click you here is the lock engaging on this 4,000-pound door, which is part of the foundation wall, and with a slight push, in you go. Jimmy Walker was the mayor of New York City during Prohibition, and legend has it that the occasion when 21 was raided by the federal government, Mayor Walker was seated down here in the wine cellar, and in the midst of the raid became so infuriated that the feds were here raiding 21, asked for a telephone, called the police department, and had them come over and ticket and tow away all of their cars.
The kind of beer the Germans were making was a little too heavy for the average American. And so in the 1860s, German-American brewers began experimenting with new kinds with recipes designed to lighten the beer to appeal to an American palate. And they began mixing into the mash either corn or rice in an attempt to use up that excess protein and create a more effervescent, light-bodied beer. And that turned out to be the secret to the extraordinary brewing industry that flourished in the late 19th century, and which was by 1900 the 5th largest industry in the United States, and which made some people astonishingly wealthy. The men who were making the finest beers were the ones who became the most successful and whose names we remember today, men like Frederick Pabst and Adolphus Busch. And what is interesting about these two men, and what I think is perhaps one of the secrets to their success, aside from their very fine beer, was that neither Busch nor Pabst had any brewing experience. They did not come from beer families. They knew nothing whatsoever about brewing. They both married into a brewing family and entered the business as young men with no ideas about how the beer should look, no ideas about how a brewery should run, but with really only one goal in mind: to become extremely successful, and to become successful in an American way. To own a factory was to be a hero of American civilization in the late 19th century. And Busch and Pabst were men who recognized that the United States was going to give them an opportunity that they never, ever would have had back in Europe. They embraced any kind of device they could find that would that would make it easier to manufacture the beer and that would allow them to produce large quantities of beer but maintain a very high quality of beer. They were about as high tech as it was possible to get. I think our hero for high-tech manufacturing in this country is usually Henry Ford. But Henry Ford came along 30 years after the brewers had already created some of these innovations and put them to work in their factories. He was actually following in the footsteps of men who had pioneered that process. In the late 1850s, Americans literally looked around and realized that Germans, despite the fact that they opened breweries, despite the fact that they opened beer gardens, despite the fact that, shock, they were sitting on Sundays drinking beer and playing cards, they were prosperous, they were healthy. There was, as one observer said at the time, no criminal element among them. These were immigrants who were doing extremely well, who were becoming models of the American dream. And yet, beer seemed to be at the heart of their culture. And the evidence is very clear that in the second half of the 1850s, Americans embraced lager beer, as it was called then, with beer being spelled B-I-E-R. It was still so foreign, it was spelled that way, as the solution to how to avoid prohibition and extreme alcohol. And indeed, dozens of juries in many cities actually heard cases in which a German saloon owner would be brought to trial for selling beer on Sunday in violation of local laws, and his attorney would argue that the saloon owner had in fact violated no laws because lager was not intoxicating. And juries consistently ruled in favor of the saloon keeper that lager beer was not an intoxicant. So by the late 1850s and throughout the 1860s and 1870s, Americans regarded beer as a beverage that was not an intoxicant. It was not in the same category as whiskey or rum or even wine. To survive in Prohibition, brewers had to figure out what they could sell that they could make a profit on. Now, the obvious thing was yeast, brewer's yeast, which could be used for baking, or for malted milks, which became very popular during the 1920s. Or they could make soft drinks, which is another beverage, or they could make near beer. The problem was you had about 185 breweries who were all making the same thing. So, and they were trying to compete with, for example, Fleischmann, which already had a corner on the yeast market. So if somebody like Pabst started making yeast, they were in effect trying to compete with something that was already a household name. The other problem that brewers faced was they had always sold their product to a tied house. They never had to really figure out how to sell directly to consumers. The brewers who survived Prohibition were the ones who had a product that they could figure out how to sell and do it well, and who figured out how to sell a product, a food product, directly to consumers by using grocery store chains. That was an entirely new business for brewers to get into. They literally had to forget what they knew about being brewers and become food distributors. The Volstead Act was the legislation, the congressional legislation, that was written to enforce prohibition. Prohibition itself only bans alcohol. It doesn't say anything about how you're going to do it, and it doesn't define alcohol. The Volstead Act defined alcohol, and it defined alcoholic beer as anything with more than 0.5% of alcohol. So if you could amend Volstead to allow sales of 3.2 beer, you would have alcoholic beer, breweries would reopen because Americans would actually drink it. They certainly weren't drinking near beer. And then brewers would be paying taxes which would go into the Treasury. So this was an easy way to sidestep the whole issue of repealing the 18th Amendment, which was going to be a lot harder to pull off. And that became the great rallying cry in the summer of 1932. Let's repeal Volstead. Franklin Roosevelt ran for president on a platform of getting the breweries open and getting Americans back to work and getting tax dollars back into the Treasury.